Why are there so many podcasts about Tottenham? Do I want to know why? They might contain insight, but mostly delusions. If I hear one more, I might die. They don't like
Hello and welcome to Poddenham Podspur, the Spurs podcast, which, for this episode, is about Spurs Women podcasts. In a break from my usual content, I'll be sharing my experiences with three podcasts that cover Spurs Women, namely N17 Women, Hometown Glory, and the Tottenham Depot, as the 25-26 Women's Super League kicks off this weekend. And as all good documentarians should, I'm going to talk about myself first. My experiences with the Spurs women team is somewhat limited. I started following the team quite seriously 2 years ago, and had been peripherally aware of the team as they rose up through the leagues, over the preceding years. But they were never a kind of a main focus of mine, and I would argue that they still aren't, and I apologize for that up front, but what I found is that the podcasts that are out there have helped me tremendously in growing my fandom for the team, for appreciating the players on the team and what they're doing, and also the things that they have to deal with. So a big shout out to everybody in the Bluesky community who does bring energy to Spurs Women match days, who does talk about the team. It's hard, and I do value tremendously the three podcasts I'm going to be discussing predominantly today, because the denominator, the number of people who watch the Spurs men's team is so large, but the flow over into the Spurs women team is depressingly low, and the love that they get from the hierarchy of Tottenham Hotspur Football Club, from ENIC, is a fraction of what it could be, and I think that's a general frustration. But yeah, so my experiences are limited, but I do like the players on the team. They're a fun team on their day. The history of the team you can go out and figure out yourself, but I'll do a little bit of front loading for people who are not so familiar. They began life 40 years ago as Broxbourne Ladies. They changed their name to Tottenham Hotspur Ladies FC in the 91-92 season. And they have risen up through the ranks to gain professional status as a women's team, and were promoted to the Women's Super League, I think, 6 years ago, something like that, 2019. They have just changed their manager. Martin Ho has come in, previously at Everton Women and Brann in Norway, I believe. Did some good work in the Champions League and has now made a step up to coaching in the Women's Super League. So it's a good team. They play predominantly at I'm trying to look at the name of it, Brisbane Road, Leyton Orient's men's home stadium. Occasionally they'll play at the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium. In fact, a few years ago they set a record for the Women's Super League when they played the North London Derby, and I think it's like 69,000 fans showed up. So there is some support there. There is some interest from the club, but yeah, as I said, it could be greater. The squad itself is an okay-ish squad, probably not as bad as the 11th place that they had last season, just above relegation, but definitely needing further reinforcement, and more could be done. There are some players who are fun to watch in there. Bethany England's probably the best player. Striker, captain. They don't score goals when Beth is out of the team, it seems like last season. Martha Thomas is a key player, Kit Graham. There's some young players like Jessica Naz, who's fun to watch. I like watching Maita Arose. I think there could be more from her this season, hopefully. But yeah, it's a good team. Stalwarts like Ashley Neville as well, who's been there for a long time with the team, has put in great work, real legend of the Spurs women team from what I can pick up. Not really moving the dial in the transfer market this year. Andrew on the Tottenham Depot pointed out that we really haven't done a lot. There was one player who came in, Toko Koga, came in, seemed to be a result of playing against her in a preseason match last season. And then today we just finished a deal up for Kathinka Tamberg. So, as Dustin George Miller said on Cartilage Free Captain, a new Tottenham player, it's a miracle. This is kind of the vibe around Spurs Women at the moment, sadly. If you think you've got it hard as a Spurs men's team fan, you ain't seen nothing yet. And that's a good and a bad thing. It's a fun ride, and they're a team that could be on the up if you get in on the ground floor. And that's part of the reason why I think you should listen to podcasts about Spurs Women. It's an interesting, almost throwback to the way things used to be in my childhood in terms of supporting Spurs. I know less about the team because there's just kind of less information out there. There's less ITK. There's kind of less coverage overall, so things are allowed time to breathe. Obviously that's a double-edged sword because that means there's kind of less investment emotionally, mentally in the team, and as Spurs Women grow, those things may creep in. I don't know what the landscape is like for other women's teams. But it's quite refreshing in that respect to be able to pick up Spurs Women and invest in them and let them sort of take all of the love that I have for Spurs. This is I'm explaining this really badly, and I'm sorry. I feel kind of self-conscious about talking about this team because I'm not a primary fan of Spurs Women, and I want to be honest about that. I think they're great. I think they're a really fun group of young women. I think they're doing tremendous work with the resources they have. I'm excited to see what's going to happen this season. But I'm one of those people who puts them in a second place behind Spurs men. But the people who do care about Spurs Women are so capable of bringing you into loving this team. I talked about the three, and I'll sort of cover them briefly now. The major player from my perspective seems to be N17 Women. They are a dedicated Spurs Women podcast. It is hosted by Abby, Caroline, Rachel, and Sean. They do great work. They've been podding for a while now, and they've really helped me, like I said, on my journey of explaining players' backgrounds and motivations and where things maybe are going wrong. Like, I'll pick up a game, I'll watch it, I'll enjoy it or not, and I do find that they add a lot of value to what I'm seeing. But whether or not you are willing to go fully in on the Spurs Women team and their podcasts is really sort of a your mileage may vary situation. I like it, I value it, but maybe you need a gateway drug. And that's where the other two podcasts that focus on Spurs Women come in. You have Hometown Glory, which is a British-based Spurs podcast that covers both the men's team and the women's team, and also has a focus on kind of wider entertainment and media culture, which is enjoyable. There you've got people like Rosa, who picks up hosting duties quite often, Billy T, who many of you will know as a member of Spurs Twitter or the Change for Tottenham movement, pops up on other podcasts like Last Word on Spurs or The Fighting Cock, yada yada. You also have Lauren over there. These are all there's a very nice distinctive style to Hometown Glory, which I enjoy. It has a very strong voice that comes through. They're not afraid of challenging each other, which I enjoy, and that's also true of N17 Women and the Tottenham Depot, which is a refreshing sort of take within the Spurs panel podcast format. I often see on the men's team that people are willing to let opinions hang out there and not be challenged as strongly as I feel like the podcasters do on these three podcasts. So it's an enjoyable one. Maybe pick up Hometown Glory if you are interested in Spurs Women, but you do need to listen to a little bit of Spurs Men alongside it to kind of just for time or whatever, right? Like maybe it's a way for you to sort of balance the two. I do find that when I listen to Hometown Glory, though, that I have massive feelings of inadequacy because their culture picks are so good and novel. And that's kind of a problem for me as the dad of a young child. So I don't get to watch a lot of TV or listen to things that I want to listen to. And the last podcast is something that I've talked about frequently on this show, and that's the Tottenham Depot. They're all American, US-based podcasters. You've got Caroline, who also shows up at N17 Women, Andrew, TC, and Todd. I like the vibe of the Tottenham Depot. Again, there's very strong challenging. There's very strong opinions over there. I think similar to Hometown Glory, if you are looking for something which has a little bit of Spurs men, a little bit of Spurs women, and gives respect and space to both of those two podcasts, that's the way to go for you if you're interested in supporting a US-based podcast. A special mention, or like a bonus mention, for The View from the Lane, which occasionally has the athletic writer Megan Feringa on. I like Megan. I like the work she does. I like the writing that she does. One criticism I have of View from the Lane is that they, by nature of being an athletic podcast, they have to platform their writers, and they don't have a dedicated Spurs women writer. But what I would love to see more of is, if podcasts that mainly focus on Spurs men are going to talk about Spurs women, is that they platform and support these people who are week on week talking about the Spurs women's team. I think that would give them space. It would be lovely if that could happen. There are a couple newsletters too, which I've read. Spurs Across the Pond, written by Caroline of N17 Women and the Tottenham Depot, as well as the Spurs Women blog. So lots of good resources out there, lots of good people on social media talking about Spurs podcasts, and I think you should listen if you are interested in women's football and have a passion for Tottenham Hotspur. Right now the timing is ripe. The England's women team are tremendous. They just won the Euros. Exciting times. Sadly, there's no Spurs women who are a kind of a consistent member of that squad. I think Beth England is probably the closest. Jessica Naz was called up earlier this year to the squad. So yeah, that's kind of where they're at. Ahead of the season, there hasn't been a ton of pre-season podcasts. I was hoping for some more to come out this week, but it seems like they had a meeting of the minds, or a sort of getting the clans around a table on Hometown Glory this week. So that was an interesting podcast. If you are looking to learn about the Spurs women before the season, I do recommend that you listen to the Hometown Glory podcast titled Praying, which I'll drop in the comments. And it had people like Rosa from Hometown Glory, had Caroline from N17 Women. I'm spacing on the other person who was on. I'm sorry about that. Generally speaking, the vibes are hopeful. Some worries. There's been some changes at the club. Last season was a bit miserable. That you can listen to the podcast, but basically Spurs Women were in a malaise, to crib a word from that podcast. Underneath the previous manager, Robert Villaham, they hadn't won a game since January, which is awful. Beth England got injured at the end of the season, and they stopped scoring goals. But the change in Martin Ho coming in, it seems to be like, from what I've heard, that the system is a lot more positive than it was previously. So no standout players is what I heard, again from Andrew on the Tottenham Depot. But the system seems to be positive, which again is I don't want to keep drawing comparisons to the Spurs men's team, but imagine surviving last season without a trophy at the end of it, but similarly, change of manager. All these things are like, they're weird coincidences. And again, I apologize for drawing comparisons between the two. This is what more seasoned podcasters who talk about Spurs women are great at doing, is not doing what I'm doing now and comparing the two, because it is unfair. So the fan base is in kind of an interesting place right now. Caroline mentioned how they were in a bad place, was actually the language she used. Probably have more weaknesses than strengths as a team, which is a little bit of a shame. That was kind of the vibe I picked up from the podcast I listened to. We'll have to see. We'll see if these changes are positive. I mean, I've put out a question on Bluesky too, because again, I'm not an expert. I watch the team, but I'm not an expert. and I did get some nice answers. I'll just quickly pull them up for you. So optimistic comes up. Ellie at White Hart Lane called it a clean slate. Encouraged but nervous. Excited about the season but disappointed with the window. Hopefully the coaching changes enough to carry us. Hopeful, apprehensive but hopeful. So generally there are somewhat good vibes. And maybe I'm not conveying that as well as I'd like. I would recommend that if you're interested in learning more about why the vibes are hopeful, that you do tune in to the Hometown Glory episode today. I think it was great, especially the sort of debate or examination around the 30-minute mark of how Spurs Women fit into the hierarchy at ENIC and the support, how support could be improved, infrastructure, money, things like that. I think it was a good listen, and it's cool. It's something you can come into. Again, if you're coming in as a fan of the men's team, your biases are present, right? Because you're, maybe anti-ENIC. I would say anti-Levy, but he just resigned today. You can come in with kind of a completely different take on it. You can come in with a fresh mind, and I find that invigorating. So I'm going to keep this short today because I already feel like I'm rambling a bit and I'm not as pointed or as insightful as I could be. All three of these podcasts are great. They do tremendous work. Give them your support. Normally I would encourage people to go out and make a podcast about Spurs on their own. And sure, you can certainly do that. But I think that it's better for us to encourage and support what's already out there for the Spurs women's team. I think there are some gaps in the space. Like, these three podcasts don't pull any punches. They're quite brutal about the women's team at times. In both an organizational sense and an on-pitch sense, but they're also kind of unforgiving to like new listeners. And if you're not willing to invest the time to get up to speed with who these players are, which, you should be if you want to start following the team, doesn't seem to be a ton of resources out there to sort of get you on board. So, if I were to have one suggestion to go out there into the ether, is I would love to see something which kind of gave me a nice little intro to the players. I feel like that's something the club should be doing, and it's such a shame that they're not. But I feel like I look at social media, especially the Instagrams for these players, and like, it's so fun to see people having fun in the Spurs jersey that it's very easy to get on board with them. But knowing who they are sort of tactically, where they've come from, ups and downs, I'd love if the podcast could kind of tackle that, like a Spurs Women 101 style podcast. I think that would be cool. But the problem there is it's targeted to naive and new listeners, but the people most likely to listen to it are probably the people who've been listening for a while. So it's kind of a question whether the juice is worth the squeeze. So yeah, they're all doing great work. I'm encouraging everybody to pick a podcast and try to stick with it for a month or two. Try to watch some games, pick a player you like, and become kind of weirdly invested in them. Mine is Olivia Holt. I don't know why. Just something about her. Just kind of, I feel like I'm waiting for her to become a superstar. And have some fun with it. Because even though I think I've leaned onto some negative parts of what comes out of these pods, they do also have fun with this team. And that's what it's all about. So, thank you for listening. I'm sorry if this is a bit rambly. Up the Spurs.